Martine, Yael, and George, thank you very much for these presentations. I think we should start with the controversy that George announced. I mean, clearly, part of the idea of assembling this group of people is that they have different opinions about how development works in the city. But I think I also I share, I think, both sympathies for both George and Martine's position. And so I've always enjoyed Martine's critique of public housing a lot. But I also very much appreciate George's innovations in terms of built form. So I'd like to try to think about how these things relate. And I think one of the central challenges that Martine, you put forward, and I think it's interesting you're a planner, but are you a physical planner? No, you're a social planner. Yeah? But it's interesting to me in planning, which has its physical dimensions, that you often think that the spatial, like the architects, of course, use the spatial, they overemphasize the spatial against the social. And I think that that's really true. But at the same time, architects and physical planners really have the spatial as a tool to engage social questions. And so I think one of the fissures that runs through the panel is this question about the efficacy of the spatial. And I think that the sequence of speakers is sort of designed to move you through a spectrum of perspectives too, where Martine really questions the spatial, and George, I think, valorizes the spatial. And I think Tower Renewal clearly is mediating between it, partly because it's informed strongly not just by architecture, but also by people in social policy and social planning. So I'm wondering if each of you could address in your own way the way you think the relationship between the spatial and the social might possibly operate, how they might affect one another. So I feel like, I know, Martine, you didn't dismiss it entirely, but you try to de-emphasize that relationship. But I'm wondering if you can speak to its possible connections, and if each of you could do so.
Sure. So, I mean, maybe it looked like I de-emphasized it, but I think that the final example that I gave was Don Mount really showed the effects of the spatial planning in Don Mount that unfortunately were quite opposite of what, you know, as I was trained in planning, what we were taught was good planning, right? And so we were kind of taught that we got to get rid of this modernist housing and bring in a new urbanist style for all of these reasons. And what ended up happening was that the spatial actually did have a huge impact in Don Mount. And that's the reason I brought up that case study today, because when I did the interviews, people would say things like, I hate it here now, and it's because it's the structure of the thing. It's how they built it. And so the spatial really came to the foreground in the case of the Don Mount redevelopment in ways that I would press when I did my interviews in Regent Park. And I should add that I did my doctoral research on Regent Park and Don Mount Court, interviewing people living in those communities. And I would ask the questions about the spatial, they didn't land as well. Whereas in Don Mount, everyone would just latch onto it. So I certainly don't overlook the importance of the spatial, and that community was tremendously important. And I think in Regent Park it was important too, because I mean there were lots of advantages to that community, to the spatial aspects of it that people spoke to, and lots of problems as well. It wasn't like the modernist planning worked perfectly for people in that community, but there were a lot of advantages to it. So I'm not sure that it's like a cohesive response, but I certainly wouldn't reject the importance of spatial planning and having an effect on social outcomes. I think that where the critique comes into play is to think that, and I think this is probably a critique that most people in this room would find sympathetic, is that you can't create social outcomes exclusively through physical planning, right? So that's the main critique there. Necessary but not sufficient.
Yeah, I think it's actually a really interesting place to land. The point I was trying to emphasize through my presentation was that when we started to look at the spatial, we realized that spatial conditions were created by a set of cultural beliefs. They were created by a set of social policies. And that in order to, so the question that we ask is, what are the conditions that would create different kinds of spaces? And those conditions are almost never architectural, and they're not spatial issues. They're issues of financing, they're issues of policy, they're issues of land ownership, they're issues of development practices, and ultimately of connectivity and delivery of services and economic supports. When I work in a number of what we might call very isolated communities across the city, where it is certainly clear to me as a practitioner that changing spatial conditions will never be enough. That stewardship stewardship and supports that economic sort of opportunity and connectivity are by far the denominating factor. That being said, we still work spatially. Those are the tools, as Adrian said, those are the tools that we have. And as such, through changing some of those economic and social conditions, we find that different spaces and spatial outcomes often result. But they are not, they don't initiate the change, right? So the change is social, economic, and a matter of public policy, and different spatial conditions arise as a result.
I don't actually think Martine and I are all that far apart on the relative potency of the spatial in architecture. Again, I'm the only. I think I'm the only one in the room that's old enough to still remember when architects thought that built form would, fundamentally change human behavior. Le Corbusier actually thought that. And he was not the only one. A whole generation of them thought that. They were going to build new buildings in a different way, and life would be transformed. And they weren't disingenuous. They actually believed it. They turned out to be wrong, but, catastrophically wrong in a number of respects. But they did actually believe it. But nobody believes it anymore. For me, the relationship of the spatial to life experience is complicated. Let me give you a few examples. The part of architecture that riles people up the most is its iconography. So this is why in the French Revolution, the revolutionaries they were, demonstrating that the Ancien Regime was toast. The world was going to be different. I mean, nobody denies that the French Revolution was unlike what Le Corbusier was predicting, the French Revolution was a real revolution. They did actually change France. But when it came to getting rid of the architecture of the Ancien Regime, demolition is hard work. They tried. I mean, they were going to destroy Versailles, but it's big, and it takes a long time. And you're the revolutionaries. You don't have access to capital and power and bulldozers. So knocking it down is just too much work. Can't manage it. Now, obelisks or statues with kings on horses, these are, pretty blatant symbols, iconographic symbols of the Ancien Regime. And with some pulleys and some rope and half a dozen strong guys, you can pull one of these over and knock it down. So, and of course, once you knock it down and it's all broken in pieces on the ground, you get a real charge off that. Hey, look, take that, king. So the icons they're potent socio-psychologically, but they're not particularly efficacious. I mean, the revolutionaries, by the way, also went after the Bastille, which of course was the prison where they were all being put before the revolution had been successful. But there too, they discovered knocking down the Bastille was just too much work, and they couldn't swing it. All right, so, the Bastille only disappeared, 60 years later with Baron Haussmann, who had access to more bulldozers and manpower than the revolutionaries did. So that's the vulnerable side of the relationship of space to politics. On the other hand, if the designer can get into the subconscious, it's a whole different story. And my example there is the shopping center. And in a shopping center, you do what the building tells you to because it doesn't give you any choice. You have to go by all the small shops to get to the big shop, and whether you like it or not, because you can't get to the big shop any other way. They will manage to persuade you that whatever level in the shopping center you are on, it's the main level. So, I mean, Eaton Center is brilliant in this respect. It has actually 4 different levels, and every one of them feels like the main level because you can get into it either right off the street at Queen or Dundas, and because the site slopes from Queen to Dundas, it gives them 2 ground floors right away. So shopping centers are a very powerful manipulative device. And the reason they work so well is, he's aware of it. We don't go around thinking, Jesus, this building's manipulating you. Because we don't even notice that it's happening, which is exactly what it's supposed to happen. So we just walk along and we go by the Apple store and the Harry Rosen and so on. We can see the Nordstrom in the distance, but we go by all the others and we might stop and buy something if we see something really enticing in the window. So for me, the spatial behavior equation depends a lot on the thresholds of consciousness. And the more conscious people are aware, the less manipulative the architecture can be.
Second half of that story. It's really interesting, and I noticed this also in the studio brief, to look at the Canadian context versus the American context when we talk about isolated communities or the inner suburbs. So your brief mentions Doug Saunders' Arrival Cities. The inner suburbs have been historically in the past decades the landing pad for new Canadians. And so when we talk about marginalization in the inner suburbs, we're not only talking about poverty, we're talking about other kinds of social need as well, which have to do with a different set of services and supports that are required. And so where I want to sort of talk more about the critique of social mix as being essentially a gentrifying phenomenon, I want to give a counterexample, which is Thorncliffe Park, for example, which is home to many tens of thousands of primarily new Canadians, which is a tower neighborhood. It's actually it's the earliest planned modernist suburb in North America, in North America, but was built actually after Flemington Park, what we know there is that people who arrive as new Canadians in Canada, often their families grow, their conditions change, they build strong community connections where they are. But if they need a different type of housing to suit them, they often find themselves having to move very far away from established communities. So one of the powerful arguments for social mix and housing mix, tenure mixes, is saying that, in fact, there is an ability for communities to cohere, for people's situations to grow and change, and for people to stay within their communities if there is more of a mix of tenure and housing types within their neighborhood. And I think that's one important critique of the sort of position that a social mix approach to redevelopment is essentially a gentrifying mode.
I don't really disagree with the value of social mix. I think it's super important, especially in the way that you've just described it. I think that in my work, and I would say that Regent Park is a very socially mixed community prior to redevelopment too, in the way that you're describing, right? There's a mix of household sizes, there's a mix of family types, there's the ethno-racial, cultural mix in that community. So it was definitely a very mixed community and had lots of value to it in that way. not income mixed. So that's why there's a forcible redevelopment happening in that community. So yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying about the value of mix. I think where my critique comes into play is not questioning the value of mix in that way, but questioning the value of the use of social mix as an idea to justify what are essentially gentrification projects. And that's typically how social mix tends to come up in planning history. You rarely see social mix being used to justify the construction of affordable housing in wealthy communities. It's typically the other way around, right? And in fact, in cases where you have a healthy social mix, like for example with the case of standalone social housing units that are mixed throughout Toronto, suddenly the value of social mix disappears when those exist, and the city is motivated by real estate development pressures and declining government funding, decides to sell those off, right? So suddenly social mix as a planning value is out the window. It tends to play second fiddle to financial motivations like the ones that underpin the revitalization of Regent Park.
I thought it maybe would be worth my saying, this is not exactly a direct critique of Martine's case studies, but a little kind of historical contextualization. Regent Park was actually two projects, not one. I mean, Regent Park North, which is the piece done from Gerrard to Dundas, is done in the late 1940s, and as she said, was the first project of its kind in Canada. The part from Dundas, south of Dundas, partly going down to Shooter, is from the 60s. It's like significantly, it's more than a decade later. And they're morphologically very different from one another. I mean, interestingly enough, in both cases, well, in the case of Regent Park North, oh yes, sorry, and before they were created, the neighborhood we now know as Don Vale and the neighborhood south of Shooter Street, going from Shooter down to Queen, were more or less continuously extended across that territory. So you could imagine Don Vale just extending southward. I mean, it's ironical that it's just east of the historical territory that I explored in the vacant lottery. But the same thing applies about the north-south streets. All the north-south streets were the historically continuous ones. The east-west ones were the ones that went in later, just as they did elsewhere in the whole eastern half of downtown. So for Regent's Park North, and it's not really this is a difference of opinion, and I would not describe Regent Park North as a modernist project, because it's a series of kind of blocks and dog bone shaped buildings, which are they're not high-rise, and they're mostly not like they don't have horizontal windows, or they don't follow any of the kind of stylistic principles of modernism. They're fairly pedestrian, moderate cost, construction cost buildings. Some of them are like E-shaped. Some of them are, there are some limited number of row houses and so on. But they all fit on the existing block structure, except because contemporary planning theory of the time, largely as far as I understand it, coming from Stein and Wright's Radburn in New Jersey, the idea of the streets going through was thought to be bad for community. So the streets were severed. The streets which already existed were severed. I mean, they were severed in a very clunky way by just like things like Jersey barriers put at the middle of the block. So you could no longer move continuously by vehicle. You could still move on foot or bicycle, but you couldn't move by vehicle continuously north-south. So that's what made the kind of compound effect around the super block for vehicles, not for pedestrians. So that's the image of the isolation effect. And the isolation effect doesn't refer so much to the people who live there as the fact that nobody who doesn't live there has any reason to be there. So it's a neighborhood, but it's not more generally part of the city, because no one who doesn't live on one of those streets has any reason to appear, other than if they're not visiting somebody. Now, south of Dundas is a modernist project, a series of high-rise buildings, very precocious high-rise buildings, designed by Peter Dickinson, one of the most important modernist architects in the history of Toronto, and a series of kind of Scandinavian-looking townhouses. The townhouses in South Regent Park look a lot like the townhouses in Don Mills, that kind of jewel of planning theory in Canadian architectural history from the same period, except of course in Don Mills, it's for the middle class, not for a low-income group. So in South Regent's Park, they did get rid of the existing north-south streets and replaced them with cul-de-sacs. And in fact, two of the Dickinson slabs, the ones that Martine's images showed us in the process of being demolished, two of them were put on across the locations of the previous street rights of way. So not only did they take out the north-south streets, they made sure they weren't going. In Regent Park North, you could easily just have taken out the Jersey barriers. But in Regent Park North, the only way you could reconnect the street grid was to demolish the towers. And interestingly enough, given that Martine works for ERA, the heritage specialists in the city of Toronto, the heritage community in Toronto tried to persuade Toronto Community Housing to save at least one of the modernist Dickinson towers because they were important pieces of architecture from the period. But the planners of the redevelopment of Regent Park were determined that they were going to reconnect the street grid, and they couldn't keep the towers and reconnect the street grid, so the towers all came down. I mean, the paradoxes of history are often kind of unbelievable, actually. The last kind of gloss on Martine's commentary that I would make, well, no, two more, and then I'll stop. That was that all of these projects involve, and actually this applies to the ones Yael showed as well. They all involve an increase in density, all of them. And the economic logic of the increase in density is that the economic revenue of the additional housing being located on the site is what generates the capital necessary for the refurbishment of what remames. And so my understanding is that in the Regent Park project, nobody was removed. Everybody who lived there previously came back. They didn't necessarily stay continuously, but they returned. So there was no relocation. Well, relocation within the site, but no relocation beyond the limits of the site. And so that was one of the commitments of the project. But in the meantime, all the new density generated cash. And of course, that's the formula that Yael and her colleagues are working with in order to find a way to fund tower renewal in the suburbs, but with one profound difference, and that is, I don't believe you showed us a single project where an existing building was being demolished, right? And this is the part of what Martine said that has given me the most pause. I mean, I thought they should have kept at least one of the Dickinson buildings, just because, you know, any architecture zoo needs one of everything, you know. So, and they were historically important. So I tended to be on the side of saying, find some goddamn way of getting that road through that, so it means you don't have to, you know, the buildings had other difficulties, so there may have been hidden agendas there. So, but anyway, I would have said keep it. And it's interesting to me that in the Regent Park redevelopment, not a single existing building has been kept. Not one. It is, in fact, a tabula rasa. By the time they're done, it's a tabula rasa. And unless I misunderstood her, Martine did not speak to that specific question as one of the issues in her critique. But I find myself thinking, if one thing for sure about people who live in an existing residential neighborhood, one thing they will always believe is where I live now is better than somewhere else that I don't know where it is, all right? And how maybe my bathroom's a little old-fashioned, but promising me an extra bathroom if I'm not sure I'm actually going to get a unit where I want it is not going to be better than what I've already got. So, you know, people's kind of rootedness in their existing situation is a profound social issue, and you toy with it at your peril. And so I find myself thinking that one of the other kind of unspoken traumas of the Regent Park project is the fact that nothing that was there before was left. And it didn't need to be like that.
We were planning to end at 5. We haven't even asked any questions from the audience, which I'd kind of like to do. But Martine, you're going to leave at 5. Okay. Because it would be great if you want to respond at all to George. Yeah. And then we'll open it up for some questions.
I agree. I think they should have kept some of the buildings, possibly all of the buildings, just to continue with the controversial opinions. You know, when I interview people, I spoke to them before and after they moved out. So I spoke to people in one phase before they moved out, phase 2 of the revitalization. And I spoke to people who had returned to phase 1. And so caught people sort of before and after. What I found is that people did really like their housing while they were living in it and could see a lot of advantages of it. And what I found when people returned to the brand new housing was that it was certainly not a runaway success in Regent Park. So in Don Mount, I will say nobody I talked to liked their new housing better than their old housing, which is shocking. In Regent Park, about 60% of the people that I spoke to preferred the new housing. But at the same time, 40% who were in brand new units and had been living in disinvested public housing felt that they rated it either the same or worse than their previous units that they've been living in the pre-revitalization Regent Park. And so I don't think it was just this rootedness that made people like their pre-revitalization homes. They actually did like them, and then compared them to what they got afterwards, which was they would refer to it as being like less strong construction and also much smaller units, often with very strange layouts, which is just related to the way that housing is built now compared to back then. I wanted to say about those towers, the Dickinson towers, those I thought they should have preserved. At least when I thought those towers were so cool because they could get a cross breeze through the whole building, and people could watch the sunset in one window and then the sun rise out the other. I guess the opposite direction, opposite order of time.
It's worth pointing out, Martine is right, and the reason for that was it's a skip corridor section. So the units are actually 2 stories high, and they have internal staircases. So, and that means that on one floor, the non-access floor, so that the unit goes through the whole building, so it doesn't really get. That's one of the things that made it risky. It also, from a fire estimate point of view, it's more complicated, but it was a deliberately frisky design in the first instance.
Yeah, really neat buildings. I was quite into them. What I found, however, was I went in there thinking people are going to love these buildings because they're so cool, and the tenants that I had the opportunity to interview, many of them didn't like them for mobility reasons because of that internal staircase. And so that, being a person that didn't have problems with mobility, I was blind to that potential issue, but a lot of people were either elderly or had illnesses and found that internal staircase was a huge burden to them, and they were very eager to get into units that were on one floor. So that was something that I found was unexpected. I'll just also add as one more comment that people were relocated off-site in Regent Park, often for many years. And in fact, 3 of the replacement buildings were also built off-site. So people who returned to Regent Park to those replacement buildings didn't return to Regent Park, they returned to other addresses outside of the community, often outside of the catchment areas of organizations that they were part of and those types of things. And lots of people didn't return at all. And there's lots of reasons for that. I mean, one of the reasons being that there's a cutoff point after which, if you start renting in Regent, you have to sign that you understand that you don't have a right to return, which is something that not a lot of people know. And also there's all sorts of ways that are informal that prevent people from returning. And so some of those are more shady, and some of those are accidental, and some of those relate to the fact simply that if people move once away from a site, it's very challenging to move back again after you've been away for 5 years. Exhausting for a lot of people who have a lot of issues in their lives. And I spoke to people who knew they were going to leave and would say things like, I have 4 kids, I have health problems, this is extremely stressful for me. Once they move me out of here, it's effectively displacing me permanently because I can't be uprooting my life in this stressful way twice. And so there's lots of ways that relocation becomes de facto displacement from the community.
So are there any questions? There's a mic. You have to speak into the mic.
Just to speak to social mix, if the integration is not improved by social mix and higher income residents will isolate themselves, is there any way for architecture to facilitate like interaction between residents of different incomes and different social circles? Or is that a job for community programming?
I think this is a really important question for places like Jane and Finch, right? We know that the intensification will come to Jane and Finch given the pressure from the LRT, given that it'll be I would say we know that this is coming. We know that development is already planned or being planned for that neighborhood. Some of the things that can help to support that integration include, I would say there are 2 or 3 factors. There's a fantastic program currently being run at Jane and Finch, for example, through the TRCA. It's called the SNAP program. This program has spent 5 or 6 years in the community working with people who live in the towers on San Romanoway and in the low-rise homes adjacent, and working together on community orchard programs. Essentially, it's a slew of programs around food. There's a set of training programs around care for this urban agriculture, people who have, say, fruit trees on their properties in low-rise homes are essentially hiring people who are being trained up, who live in the towers, who are then harvesting them. So that's an example of something that's a program. It's a program-based solution or approach to sort of community integration and connectivity. And in fact, it's a very strong community over there. Ultimately, what we know is going to happen, what's already happening on numerous sites in, let's say, hotter development markets in Toronto, is that there will be infill intensification on the tower sites themselves, and that there are a number of ways that added density can either support or inhibit the ability for new communities to connect. One of the worst examples is when you see a row of townhomes turning its back to a tower, so creating, a more vibrant street front. You know, this sort of tower morphology that was actually deliberately set far back from the street. You'll see that at San Romanoway as well. Leaving these sort of vast open spaces, the tower and the park model. Today's planning guidelines would say create a street wall, right? But that means that the back end of that new infill form is essentially facing the towers, and the towers are then second tier from an urban design perspective. So other built forms that have that that have two sides, that have a back and a front, that create internal conditions, that create new kinds of urbanism that don't just favor the avenue approach, but instead favor, say, courtyards or other connected spaces, are really critical there. And there are some good examples. There's an interesting example at Isabella and Church, which is so that would be a redevelopment site, not a development site, but it was a 1960s era tower where a second tower was essentially spliced onto it, but they were integrated in a way that they from the exterior, you can't tell the difference. Rents did not go up for the existing residents, and there are internal connections between the two. So that's an interesting form of urbanism that says, in fact, this is doubling the density. It's creating net improvements for everybody, a new amenity for everybody that is shared, and isn't a two-address kind of approach to intensification. So that's an urban design and architectural form approach, which tries to bridge the divide.
I actually have a few thoughts about this. You know that situation where you go to camp, you're a teenage kid and you go to camp, and some of the people you know and some of the people you don't, and you're all gathered around in a big circle, and then some eager beaver leader says, now we're all going to be friends. And your logical teenage instinct is, oh yeah, we'll see about that. Well, my attitude to social mix is a bit like that. Like, I don't want somebody saying to me, you know, be friendly with that person you're sitting beside that you've never met before. I'll decide for myself, thanks. So for me, social, I'll take my case of Toronto, social mix, the really good vehicle for social mix is the street. Because nobody has to prove why they're there. We're all entitled to be there. We don't have to, we don't have to be sociable with anybody else we meet in the street. We can if we want, but there's no obligation. And we're all there, and we can see everybody else in the city or every other kind of person in the city there. My other example is transit. And transit even hikes the stakes on it a little bit more, because on the street, if there's, some guy screaming, which occasionally happens, you sort of avert your gaze and pretend you didn't notice and go around the corner. When you're on transit, it's a little more complicated, all right? But I've already talked about how old I am. I'm really struck in Toronto. I think of myself as a relatively mobile person. I cannot believe the number of people on a subway car in Toronto that will offer me their seat when I get on the subway car. It's astonishing. And nobody's, there are probably posters saying, if an elderly person gets on the car, it would be polite for you to get up. But they do. They do. It's remarkable.
Are there other questions?
I have a question for Yale. You had mentioned something about 1984 and the importance of buildings or towers built before that. If you could elaborate a little bit on that, that would be wonderful.
Yeah. So ultimately, in the post-war years, there was a real nation building. There was a I would say a national kind of ideological bent towards nation building that was stimulating the economy, that was providing decent housing for the middle class, right? And so, and there was a sort of sensibility that the sort of social cohesion that could be found in modernist planning that was mainly brought over from European planners, but also European architects coming here after the war, was actually the best way to create create cities, and that maintaining large open spaces was preferable to the sort of cramped, small slices of green space that you'd begin to see in some of the forms that George was showing in the redevelopment. And so the density, the high-rise apartment tower kind of typology was incented by construction, was essentially incented by construction practices brought over from the EU, by supply side subsidies, and then by tax treatments for people who are operating rental buildings, who are building and operating rental buildings. But there was a political shift that came in sort of the Thatcher era, world. There was a sort of Western shift towards home ownership, and that was a different sensibility about social responsibility, being owning your piece of land and keeping it safe. And I think George could probably speak more to this than I could. But ultimately, this came with a incenting of home ownership. And all of those subsidies at the federal level were then transferred over to developers developing single-family homes. And you see in that time a different kind of urbanism being built as a result. One thing to note, which is interesting, is that to this day, the rental properties built up until 1984 are taxed. So the owner, so a single owner, most of them private owners, are taxed as commercial properties, and they're taxed at a higher property tax rate than a condo, right, which is taxed at a residential rate. And so, in fact, if you look at it today, there is a perverse tax incentive to building new purpose-built rental from a tax perspective as well. These are the kinds of tweaks that make it difficult today to continue to build purpose-built rental, and there are a number of initiatives at the provincial level which are changing that. But today, apartment owner of a building providing relatively affordable rental housing below market rental housing is paying much higher tax rates than a condo owner.
It's kind of astounding when you think of it. I mean, that's one of these, an inadvertent stupidity. I mean, the tax planners think, people living at home should pay lower taxes than people making money off commercial property. Well, yeah, maybe that makes sense. But when it turns out the commercial property is a rental residential building, when it turns out that the rental residential building is one that is one of the only forms of affordable housing which is available to lower income groups in the city, and you're making the owner of that building pay higher taxes than somebody in an owned house or a townhouse, I mean, it shows how the stupidity of the implementation of policy. I mean, Martine talked a lot about unintended effects. Well, this is a classic example of something which is doing exactly the opposite of what you would expect the tax system to do. Just because nobody's figured out that a commercial property that's a residential low-income rental is a different kind of commercial property than a McDonald's.
Okay, maybe we have time for one more question. So maybe, I don't know who here, we got a lot of questions. Or maybe, okay, why don't we actually ask 3 questions, but we'll ask them all at once, and then you can respond. So Chris, person in the middle, and then Hannah.
So my question is about the sustainability of redevelopment. Since after George, you point out the historical paradox of the Victorian Tower making way for the modernist tower, which then is now being made way for the new urbanist, with, of course, in Regent Park. My question is that is there a way to stop this redevelopment? Is there a way to build sustainably where towers and residences become relevant in the future and remain within an integral part of the urban fabric?
I live in a neighborhood near the University of Waterloo, near Laurier. And as somebody who wants, like our neighborhood's half residents that own their own houses and half students. So we organize a barbecue and I want to invite students to it. So, but the frustration I have is that we have more and more high rises that are closed access. So I think that's not a good thing, but I'd like your comments on what is a good built form in the prospect of neighborhood development for those of us who, for selfish reasons, want to develop relations with our neighbors.
Okay, so I think that the conversation between George and Martine has been really interesting, but looking at a specific timeline and that being dictating the success of these projects in times of transition. So it's kind of hard to delineate the opinions of the occupants based on, or trying to understand their psychology of how they came about to these opinions, if it's just that they kind of, like George was saying, were rooted in their old life and their old home that they'd been working on for 20 years, and then it's this period of change, and it's hard to understand what's better or not. So I was wondering if maybe you two could speak on how you would evaluate the success of these projects based on the new opportunities for growth, mix, or evolution that are, 10 to 20 years down the road compared to what was previously offered. Because I think potentially you might find that certain communities remain very stagnant in how they operate, and rather than growing beyond what was intended for them. So maybe do these new proposals offer kind of a grander scheme of evolution that could follow the city's growth as well?
I think Martine's really got to go. So I think we should give you each 2 minutes to respond to the 3 questions.
Yeah, to the person in Waterloo, how long is it going to take me to drive there right now? Because I have to go to work. I just don't want to be late for my class. I will say, first I want to make a comment in response to the question about how do you create successful social mix, your question at the back. One of the things that happened in Don Mount when I was there was an intention to try to build mixed income community interaction that was facilitated by a community worker. And that was really interesting. I mean, I kind of agree with what George says. You can't kind of force people to be friends. And so there is a strange idea that mixed income interaction is going to lead to friendships, whereas like people don't necessarily make friends that way. But what I would say as a caution is that one must be aware of the broader power dynamics and inequality in society when convening groups with vastly different, I guess I would say, relationships of power. And so when you have a high income people living in private housing, predominantly white people, and then they are interacting with low income racially marginalized tenants living in public housing, some of the dynamics that you might expect end up happening in that mixed income community interaction and not to the advantage of the tenants. And so what I saw happening in Don Mount through an intentional initiative to have mixed income community governance was that some of the more active market residents, who I don't think necessarily represent the way that all market residents are, use their power and clout in ways that were detrimental to the tenants. And so the unfortunate thing about the structure of that community governance exercise was that there was no way that the person running it had accounted for this to protect the tenants and ensure that their voices weren't going to be trampled in this mixed income dynamic. And so to me, if you're going to try and create community governance structures in mixed income neighborhoods, there has to be a way to ensure that the lower income residents in those structures have some sort of protection, right? And so what would happen, I'll just give you a small example, is that in the example that I spoke about, people would say, we won't have anything to do with this. We're going to quit because our property values matter to us, and we're going to walk away. And we're going to call our local councillor, and we're going to call our federal representative. And we're going to do all of this and that. We're going to call your boss. They'd say that to the community organizer. And this had people shaking in their boots, right? And so they were like, we won't do anything but what matters to our constituency. And so that kind of coming to the table with that kind of like flexing of muscle to be like, we want to do what's in our own interests and to hell with these public housing residents is not a good recipe for like positive community governance that will be advantageous to lower income residents in public housing. So thinking about those power dynamics when structuring any type of governance, I think is really, really important. And then the question of like, well, what will this be like later? Put aside perhaps how people are responding to it now. I think it's an interesting question to think about these things over time and how they'll mature. I think in answer to like how will Regent Park be later, I think that the housing there is going to decline, the new housing is going to decline and deteriorate even faster than the old housing because it's built to a lower quality standard. And in fact, people who were in those buildings right away found that they were falling apart around them, you know? Really quickly. And so people could anticipate that this isn't going to last very long. And in fact, the same underfunding problems that affected Toronto community housing beforehand are continuing to affect them, and they can't put enough money into maintaining those buildings as it is. But I will also say that I would be cautious of trying to dismiss the relevant concerns of people in the present moment, because that's a risky business that you get into, right? And deciding that maybe we know more and maybe in the future it'll all be, their suffering will have been worth it, can put planners and architects and others who can consider themselves to be experts in a very dangerous position. So that would be my comment related to that. And then with that, I really should go to work, but I enjoyed being a part of this, and I know that you can't force friendship through social mix, but I do hope that we're all friends. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Martine. What a great way to leave it. I want to talk a little bit about how we can, and I think this in a way relates to three questions at once, but what are some of the tools in the toolkit that we can mobilize to ensure that in areas where we know change will happen, that the change is actually supporting the communities already in place, and providing benefits to those communities. I don't think we can say that, and so I'm not speaking here in particular about Regent Park, but I'm talking here about like inner suburbs throughout the city that are getting, let's say, major public investments, or in some cases not getting major public investments, but where we know cities are growing and change will happen. When we talk about some of the objectives around tower renewal, we say we cannot lose this core backbone affordable housing to deterioration on the one hand, or to gentrification on the other. On a really bare bones level, the City of Toronto, through the City of Toronto Act, has a set of unique abilities to maintain rental housing. In other cities, affordable rentals being lost to condominiumization. Here in Toronto, we can't do that. We say if you own more than 6 rental units, you cannot lose one of them. If you demolish one of them, you'll have to replace it with another rental unit, right? So we have a few protections on that level, but on the level of development, on the level of intensification through infill, we have less levers. Cities try to do things like use their official plans, say, for example, create a secondary plan that says, if change happens here and we anticipate it will, here are the parameters from a land use perspective. Here are the parameters. It can be, the zoning will be like this, the uses will be like this, the heights will be like this, right? And sets guidelines about relationships between existing and new buildings. That's one thing. One thing we're trying to look at in this piece I mentioned that we're doing for the Growth Secretariat, which anticipates intensification in the region and says we want to do so in a manner that provides benefit back to all of the communities around it. That is, creates complete communities, walkable. You can live, you can work, you can eat, you can buy, your kids can go to daycare and school, etc. In your community. One of the tools in our toolkit that we're not using is something like community permit planning system, used to be called development permit system, which says areas that are slated for intensification, we sit down with the community through a meaningful engagement and consultation process over a period of years and say, what are the values of this community? What are the things that are important to us? How does so is this community, a model of community-led change? How can we maintain affordability? How can we make sure that building that comes in here offers particular benefits that are particular to us, that is, uses things like the Section 37 allowance, but brings them to bear on the site? And as change and infill happens on a parcel by parcel basis, that benefit can be bundled together for larger and more wide-reaching benefits. It also allows for things like the last mile, saying, okay, how do I get from my transit stop to my house if I have to walk around 6 fences? And says, okay, maybe there are easements here and there. So we need more than our secondary plans and area and site-specific planning can kind of allow when we're talking about community benefit. How do we build in community benefits agreements that allow, for example, for local labor to be used when new building is happening, providing skills and jobs training? There are a whole set of qualitative properties that there are certain planning tools which may begin to get at it. They're not yet being implemented to this day. This tool legislated by the province has only been used in 2 or 3 places throughout the province because it's a lot of work and it's hard for cities to put resources into these kinds of community-led planning operations. But those are the kinds of things we're going to need to see if we're going to take seriously change that provides widespread benefit to the communities already in place.
Actually, a delicious little footnote to what Yael just said. Somebody told me yesterday that Jennifer Keesmaat was quoted, maybe she did this on a blog, that Google is going to spend as much money on a public consultation process for the design of their new headquarters on the Quayside site in waterfront Toronto as the City of Toronto has to run the planning department for an entire year. My concluding 2 cents worth is as follows. Well, number 1, watch out for kind of inadequate conceptual follow-through. And I'm going to use 2 examples. The first one is the suburban developments that Yael talked about. A number of the ones she showed, she actually referred to the problem of the fences, but she went over it fast, and I just want to make sure this is clear. The overall plan of those precincts was based on the European modernist idea that the towers are in a park, all right? If you go to Roehampton, the famous example of the London County Council in the western suburbs of London, you see, I mean, they have nice grass in London anyway, as you know, but you see the rolling grass lawn just keeps on going in between the buildings, under the buildings, or over the hills, and so it goes. And it's mown properly, all right? And the whole thing is owned by the London, it'll be the local borough council. The equivalent privately owned ones in the Toronto suburbs that Yael and her colleagues have been working on, the buildings are site planned as though that same set of conditions pertained, but then for mortgaging purposes, the individual buildings are divided up from one another, and so that they can be separately mortgaged from one another, and each private owner has his own mortgage. However, once the it's a kind of reparcelization that takes place after the fact, then of course the real estate lawyers get into the act and say, if a kid gets hurt on this piece of lawn rather than that piece of lawn, you could be up on a liability insurance problem. So each owner then puts up a chain link fence around his parcel. And so lo and behold, instead of the rolling continuous green lawn that you get in West London, you get chain link fences chopping all of this up into small pieces around each of the buildings. And as you all know, if any of you that have had summer jobs mowing lawns, you can't get a power mower close to a chain link fence. So where the fence, at the edges of the fence is all kind of weeds and dandelions and so on. And then before long, there's no point for anybody to try to move through this territory as a whole, because the whole thing is full of pedestrian dead ends. You can't get out. You have to go out and around the edge, one of the differences between public and private property. So you have a complete betrayal of the original landscape concept because of the particular socio-political circumstances within which the idea has been implemented in a different country. So, I mean, this is a stupidity that architects ought to be able to anticipate. I would go to, I mean, one of the other interesting distinctions for me between Yael's two case studies is that, as I said at the beginning of my presentation, Regent Park is considered to be state of the art, okay? That's, the best practices of how to do this stuff, or so we thought until she came along.
George Baird is the former dean of the Daniels Faculty of Architecture.
Oh, well, that's true. That's true.
And Daniels company is the developer
Oh,
of Regent Park.
yes. It's all true. It's all true. So, but anyway, I wanted to make a comparison between Regent Park on the one hand and Donmount on the other, because for me, Donmount, I mean, the funny thing about Donmount is the first Donmount was terrible, notwithstanding what Martine said about people liking it. You could probably even tell from the photographs she showed of it. It was like dingy, and again, the grass was all trampled. The first Donmount was horrible.
But it was Moriama.
It was Moriama, of course it was Moriama. It's very late Moriama. But for me, the interesting, yes, it was Moriama, yes. So, but then the replacement Donmount it's what I would call formulaic new urbanism. And you can see that I don't know, she didn't go over the site plan in any detail, but you can see there's one social housing building. Like 3/4 of the site is private housing. The top, maybe no, sorry, I'm exaggerating. It's more than half is private housing. And then the south end is the new park. But of course, the new park is not specific to that precinct anymore. It's a neighborhood park. Not that that's a bad thing, but it's not like the internal courtyard of the old building. And then there's one social housing building in the middle. So no wonder the tenants were outnumbered at that community meeting she described, because there aren't enough of them. The ratio between the private ownership component of the project and the social housing component is so skewed in the favor of the private that, those social housing people they're kind of lucky they're able to be there at all. Right? So there again, you could see this is nothing like what anybody would have intended, proposing that model of redevelopment. But and I suspect that the political internal workings of Regent Park are not as blatant as they are at Downtown. I would guess that. So it's important to understand when you're following a model to know what all the kind of constituent components of the model actually are, and what the downside risks of departing from aspects of the model actually are in the implementation in a different social and geographical setting. Just to end on a happy note, there are a few things that happen right in these situations, and I wanted to mention the innovation of the French firm Lacato and Vassal that figured out a way of dealing with the new skin of a social housing tower without the tenants having to move out at all. So all the work, they basically add on a kind of new, thick new chunk of building outside the building face, and complete all that, and then they only take out the glazing and the door that previously went from the old inside onto a balcony. They only remove that at the last moment in the renovation process. And it is, of course, disruptive for the tenants, but it's disruptive like having the windows replaced in your living room, all right? It's not great, but, you don't have to move out for 5 years while they do it, which is what happened with the people in Regent Park. So, and I think I saw some examples of that in some of your axonometrics, but yeah, going by in the president. So, I mean, devices which minimize the disruption for the existing occupants of that kind, it seems to me, are of enormous significance in these situations. Thank you.
So thanks very much, George.